Bishnu leaves the frantic noise of the city behind to return to the rain-slicked alleys and ancestral warmth of North Kolkata. Surrounded by the rhythmic rituals of tea and the slow stories of family, he struggles to let go of his urban urgency. Listen as he discovers the meditative peace of a slower pace of life. 9. Bishnu pressed his forehead against the window glass, the coldness of the pain biting into his skin. Outside, the skyline of the city was losing its edges, dissolving into a gray, misty blur that swallowed the concrete towers and the jagged electricity lines. The glass vibrated against his skull, a constant humming frequency that seemed to synchronize with the rhythmic click-clack of the rails. It was a steady percussion, a mechanical heartbeat that began to methodically erase the phantom noise of the city, the shrieking horns of yellow taxis, the overlapping shouts of vendors, and the relentless, grinding gearshift of a million hurried lives. He shifted in the worn vinyl seat, the material sticking to his damp shirt. He rubbed his thumbs together slowly, a repetitive, circular motion that he had performed 1,000 times behind the steaming vats of his tea stall. For years, his hands had been instruments of urgency, measuring tea leaves and pouring streams of milk with a precision born of pressure. Even now, with the city receding, he could feel the ghost tension residing in the traps of his shoulders, a tight knot that refused to loosen. He imagined the knot as a physical object, a rusted bolt that had been turned too tight for too long, resisting the first attempts of a wrench. Across the aisle, a man in a pressed white shirt was fighting a war with his wrist. He checked his watch every 30 seconds, his eyes darting from the dial to the window and back again, his leg bouncing in a frantic staccato rhythm. The man's anxiety was a sharp, discordant note in the cabin. Bishnu watched him with a detached curiosity, noticing how the man gripped the handle of his briefcase until his knuckles turned the color of bleached bone. To the man, the train was a delay, a barrier between himself and some urgent destination. To Bishnu, the delay was the destination. He wanted the slowing. He wanted the friction of the world to decrease until he reached a state of near stasis. As the train began to decelerate, it let out a long, metal-sharp sigh. The sound stretched across the carriage, a piercing hiss of brakes that sounded as if the machine itself were finally exhaling after a decade of holding its breath. The vibration in the floorboards shifted from a roar to a shudder, then to a silence that felt heavy and intentional. Bishnu didn't move immediately. He stayed leaned against the glass, watching the mist thicken into a curtain of white that obscured the horizon. He reached down to touch the strap of his bag. It was a heavy canvas thing, weighted with a few changes of clothes and a collection of small brass utensils he had brought from his own kitchen. The bag served as a physical anchor, a ballast that kept him from floating away into the haze. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't moving toward a deadline or a quota. He wasn't calculating the cost of charcoal or the timing of a morning rush. He was simply moving toward a person, and the thought made the air in his lungs feel thinner, cleaner. How much of me is still there? The question spiked through his mind, sudden and intrusive. The man who left this house was a boy who liked the smell of cinnamon and the sound of the rain on the courtyard tiles. Now I am a man who knows how to handle a crowd of 50 angry commuters in a 10-minute window. Have I become too loud for the silence of that house? He wondered if he would find the stillness oppressive, or if he would try to fill it with the habits of the city, pacing the corridors like a caged animal. The fear was a cold sliver in his chest, the worry that he had forgotten how to be slow, and that the art of doing nothing had become a foreign language he could no longer speak. Then a single, heavy drop of rain struck the window. It was a fat, solitary bead that smeared across the glass, followed instantly by 1,000 more. Within seconds, the world outside transitioned into an impressionist painting, all blurred greens and charcoal grays. The rain didn't fall so much as it arrived, a sudden saturation that turned the air into a liquid weight. Bishnu watched the water race in rivulets down the pane, the streaks creating a distorted lens through which the platform appeared as a shimmering, unstable ghost of a place. When the doors finally slid open, the sound was a wet slap. Bishnu stepped out onto the platform, and the damp air immediately claimed him. It carried a scent that hit him with the force of a memory, the sharp, sharp tang of old rails mixed with the deep, loamy smell of wet earth. It was the smell of North Kolkata in the monsoon, a scent of decay and rebirth, of ancient brick soaking up the deluge and the sweetness of distant, rotting fruit. He closed his eyes for a moment, tilting his head to listen to the rain drumming on the corrugated tin roof of the station. The sound was a chaotic symphony, yet it felt more organized than any city street he had ever navigated. He reached into the pocket of his trousers, his fingers brushing against a small piece of paper. He withdrew the note from Kalyani, the ink having succumbed to the pervasive humidity. The edges of the parchment were curled, and the handwriting, usually a steady, elegant script, had begun to bleed. The letters were smudged, purple ink running in thin veins across the page like a map of a river delta. He couldn't make out every word, but he didn't need to. The mere presence of the paper, the tactile reality of her handwriting, acted as a compass. He stood there for a long minute, ignoring the few other passengers who pushed past him with umbrellas held like shields. He didn't want to rush. He wanted to feel the humidity settle into his skin, to let the dampness seep into his clothes until he was indistinguishable from the atmosphere. He looked down at his hands. The thumbs were still moving, rubbing together in that slow, rhythmic circle. The city was still in his marrow, but as he stepped off the platform and into the rain-slicked alley, he felt the first layer of that tension begin to peel away. He began to walk, his boots splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the leaden sky. Every few steps, he paused to observe a detail: a rusted iron gate overgrown with wild vines, a stray dog shivering under the eaves of a closed tea shop, the way the moss clung to the damp brickwork in vivid neon greens. He was no longer measuring time by the clock on the wall, but by the distance between the raindrops. The path to his grandmother's house was a winding descent into a slower century, and as the familiar architecture of the old quarter rose to meet him, he felt a strange, fluttering anticipation in his throat. As he turned the final corner, the ancestral home appeared through the mist. It was a sprawling, weathered structure of lime plaster and teak, its balconies sagging slightly under the weight of time and rain. The house looked exhausted, as if it had been dreaming for decades and was only now beginning to wake. He stopped at the edge of the courtyard, his gaze landing on the heavy wooden door. He didn't knock immediately. Instead, he stood in the downpour, watching the water cascade from the roof in thick silver sheets, wondering if the silence inside would be a sanctuary or a mirror reflecting everything he had lost. The scent of wet brick. The wind caught the umbrella with a violent, sudden snap, nearly wrenching the handle from Bishnu's grip. He braced his feet against the slick pavement, muscles tightening in his shoulders as the black fabric buckled upward, threatening to flip inside out and leave him exposed to the onslaught. For a moment he was in a tug-of-war with the sky, the metal ribs of the umbrella groaning under the pressure. He leaned his weight forward, fighting the gust with a slow, deliberate strength, until the wind relented and the canopy settled back into its dome. He stood there for a second, chest heaving, the cold spray of rain stinging the bridge of his nose, feeling the heavy vibration of the city's restlessness still clinging to his skin like a second coat of clothes. He began to move again, turning away from the main thoroughfare and slipping into the narrow arteries of North Kolkata. Here, the world narrowed into a canyon of saturated crimson. The rain-slicked bricks of the old houses glowed with a deep, visceral red, the color bleeding into the gray of the pavement. The architecture here didn't just stand, it leaned, the buildings bowing toward one another as if sharing secrets across the alleyways. Bishnu slowed his pace, his boots making a soft, wet, rhythmic sound, shlap, shlap, against the stones. He watched the water cascade from the ornate cornices above, creating shimmering curtains of silver that blurred the edges of the world. The humidity was a physical weight, a warm, invisible blanket that pressed against his chest, making the simple act of breathing feel like a conscious choice. Near a collapsed pile of limestone rubble, he stopped. A stray cat, a lean creature with one notched ear and fur the color of wet ash, was huddled beneath a rusted corrugated iron sheet. The cat didn't bolt at the sound of his approach. Instead, it watched him with amber eyes, its body curled into a tight, shivering ball. As Bishnu paused, the cat gave a slow, deliberate blink, a gesture of profound indifference that mirrored the deceleration Bishnu felt in his own marrow. He found himself mimicking the animal, his eyelids drooping, his heart rate slipping from the frantic tempo of the city to something closer to the drip of a leaky faucet. He stayed there for a long minute, simply watching the way the rain beaded on the cat's whiskers, feeling the urban urgency dissolve into the damp air. The air here was different from the city center. It didn't smell of exhaust and burnt rubber, but of damp moss and ancient, decaying limestone. It was a scent that felt heavy, almost edible, as if the history of the neighborhood had been dissolved by the rain and turned into a thick, aromatic vapor. He inhaled deeply, and the smell settled in the back of his throat, tasting of salt and old earth. He noticed the water channeling through the gutters in predictable, rhythmic streams, carving miniature rivers through the grime of the street. He followed these currents, letting the flow of the water act as a guide, leading him deeper into the labyrinth where the sounds of the distant traffic were replaced by the steady, hypnotic percussion of rain on tin roofs. As he crossed a small bridge over a stagnant canal, an old vendor sitting under a tattered blue tarp caught his eye. The man was selling something wrapped in wax paper, his skin like cured leather and his eyes clouded with cataracts. As Bishnu passed, the vendor didn't speak, but he raised a hand in a slow, knowing gesture. A slight tilt of the head and a wave of the fingers that felt like a recognition. It wasn't the greeting of a stranger, but the acknowledgement of a returning son. The gesture anchored Bishnu to the ground. He wasn't just a visitor in a foreign place, but a piece of a puzzle returning to its original slot. He nodded back, a low, slow movement, feeling a sudden, sharp lump form in his throat that he couldn't quite swallow. He felt the physical resistance of the humidity now, the air becoming so thick it felt as though he were wading through warm honey. Every step required a deliberate effort of will, his clothes clinging to his skin, heavy and sodden. He didn't mind the discomfort. There was something honest about the way the rain claimed everything, erasing the boundaries between the body and the environment. He wondered if he was finally shedding the skin of the man who brewed tea for 1,000 rushing strangers, a man who lived by the ticking of a clock and the demand for speed. Was it possible to simply stop? To become as stationary as the moss on the brickwork? He imagined himself dissolving into the architecture, his bones turning to limestone and his breath becoming the mist that clung to the balconies. He stopped at the mouth of the final alley, the silence here so profound it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of a wooden shutter slamming in the wind. He reached the heavy wooden gate of his grandmother's house, the timber grayed by decades of monsoon and sun. He placed his hand on the surface, feeling the grain of the wood deep, rough grooves that felt like a braille map of his own childhood. He pushed, and the iron hinges groaned with a familiar, low-frequency pitch, a long, metal-sharp sigh that seemed to announce his arrival to the very foundations of the house. The sound vibrated through his palm, a resonant chord that echoed the humming quality of his grandmother's voice. As the gate swung open, revealing the inner courtyard, Bishnu's foot paused mid-stride. The courtyard was a square of gray stone, the center occupied by a small, stagnant pool of rainwater reflecting the leaden sky. But there, etched clearly into the soft, red mud near the entrance, was a set of footprints. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp and unblurred by the rain, leading away from the gate and toward the inner sanctum of the house. He stared at them, his thumbs beginning to rub together in a slow, anxious circle. They were too large to be gories, and too precise to be the haphazard steps of a delivery man. He hadn't been told anyone else was here. The sanctuary he had imagined, a place of solitary stillness and ancestral ghosts, had already been breached by a living presence, and the sudden uncertainty felt like a cold draft cutting through the humidity. Red Oxide welcomes. Bishnu stepped over the threshold, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him and severing the roar of the rain into a distant, muffled hum. He stopped in the entryway, where the air smelled of damp lime, old paper, and a faint, lingering sweetness that reminded him of burnt sugar and cardamom. His clothes were heavy, the cotton of his shirt clinging to his shoulder blades with a cold, oppressive weight. He reached for the buttons, his fingers slightly numb, and peeled away the damp outer layers. When the fabric hit the floor, it did so with a satisfying, muted thud, a sound that felt like the first actual subtraction of weight from his life in 3 years. He stood there for a moment in his undershirt, listening to the house breathe. The silence here, not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, thick and smooth. He shifted his weight, and his bare soles made first contact with the red oxide floors. The surface was cool and impossibly smooth, polished by a century of footsteps into a deep, blood-orange mirror that seemed to swallow the dim light. The sudden chill of the floor grounding him was visceral. It was a sharp, clean contrast to the sticky humidity of the street. He felt the tension in his calves loosen, the phantom vibration of the city's traffic finally fading from his bones. He walked slowly, his footsteps making no sound on the oxide, moving deeper into the dim corridor, where the walls were lined with dark wood paneling and framed photographs of ancestors whose eyes seemed to watch him with a patient, timeless curiosity. As he rounded the corner into the kitchen, he found Kalyani. She had her back to him, her slight frame draped in a cream-colored cotton saree with a thin red border. She was standing over a wide brass pot, her arm moving in a slow, hypnotic, clockwise motion. The wooden spoon she held didn't just stir the contents, it seemed to govern the very gravity of the room. Each rotation was deliberate, a rhythmic cycle that matched the slow drip of water from the eaves outside. The steam rising from the pot carried a scent so dense it felt tactile, the earthy caramel depth of Nolan Gur, the date palm jaggery that defined the winters of North Kolkata. He stayed there for a long minute, watching the steady orbit of her hand, feeling the frantic ticking of his internal clock begin to slow down to match her pace. "You've brought the city in your shoulders, Bishnu," she said. She didn't turn around, yet her voice, raspy and warm, like old parchment rubbing together, cut through the steam with an intuitive precision. "You are standing there like a man who is afraid the floor will move beneath him. Sit. Let the house hold you for a while." Bishnu opened his mouth to speak, the words already forming in his mind. He wanted to tell her about the screaming sirens of the intersection, the way the crowds pushed against one another in a desperate, collective hurry, and the exhaustion that had become a permanent resident in his marrow. He wanted to explain the urgency that had driven him to leave, the feeling that he was being erased by 1,000 small, fast demands. But as he studied the simmering pot and the steady, unhurried movement of his grandmother's shoulder, the words felt clumsy. They felt like jagged pieces of glass in a room made of silk. To speak of the city's urgency here seemed not only unnecessary, but almost profane, as if he were introducing a virus into a sanctuary. Kalyani finally turned, her movements fluid and slow. She didn't smile with her mouth so much as with the soft crinkling of the skin around her eyes. She reached for a small, unglazed clay cup, a bahar, and poured a stream of tea that was the color of polished mahogany. She stepped toward him, the fabric of her saree whispering against the red oxide floor, and pressed the cup into his palms. The warmth seeped through the porous ceramic instantly, a direct heat that bypassed the skin and seemed to settle directly into the joints of his fingers. As the heat radiated upward, Bishnu felt his shoulders drop an inch, then two, the habitual hunch of the chaiwala finally collapsing under the weight of the silence. He carried the tea to the edge of the central courtyard, where the roof opened to the sky. The rain was falling in a perfect vertical curtain, a shimmering wall of gray water that crashed into the central pool with a constant soothing white noise. He leaned against a pillar of carved teak, the wood cool and smelling of ancient oil. He watched a single drop of water cling to a leaf of a potted palm, trembling with the weight of its own existence before finally surrendering to gravity. He realized then that the house didn't just hold memories or ghosts, it held a different frequency of time altogether. Here, a minute wasn't a unit of productivity, but a space to be inhabited. The red oxide floors, the smell of jaggery, the rhythmic rain, they were all parts of a machine designed to slow a human heart back to its natural rhythm. He took a sip of the tea. It was thick, sweetened with the date palm syrup, with a hint of ginger that warmed the back of his throat. He closed his eyes and tilted his head, listening to the rain. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't known was tied. He wondered if this was what it meant to truly return, not just to a place, but to a version of himself that didn't need to rush. He thought of the smudged note from Kalyani, the one that had summoned him back, and felt a surge of gratitude for her stubborn refusal to modernize, for her insistence on the slow stir and the clay cup. Just as he began to sink deeper into the meditative hum of the afternoon, a sound broke through the white noise of the rain. It was a sharp, precise tapping, a rhythmic tick-tick, tick-tick, coming from the upper balcony. It wasn't the haphazard sound of a leak or the wind rattling a shutter. It was intentional. It was the sound of a tool hitting a surface with calculated intent. Bishnu looked up, squinting against the dim light of the corridor. High above, perched on the edge of the mahogany railing of the second floor, a figure was silhouetted against the gray sky. The stranger was leaning over a large sketchbook, a pencil moving in rapid, precise strokes across the paper, capturing the geometry of the rain and the red oxide courtyard below. Bishnu froze, the clay cup still pressed to his lips. The footprints he had seen in the mud earlier now had a source. He watched the figure shift, the light catching a pair of thick-rimmed glasses that glinted like two small mirrors. The man didn't look down, his focus entirely consumed by the page, his movements clinical and detached, as if he were dissecting the house with his pencil. The piece Bishnu had just begun to cultivate felt suddenly fragile, a thin sheet of glass that had just been stepped upon. He didn't know who this man was, or why he had been allowed into the inner sanctum of the house without warning. He set the teacup down on the teak pillar with a slow, careful motion, his thumbs beginning to rub together in that familiar, anxious circle. He looked back toward the kitchen, where Kalyani was still humming a low, resonant tune, seemingly oblivious to the intruder above. The contrast between the grandmother's somniferous grace and the stranger's analytical precision created a tension in the air, a sudden friction that made the humidity feel heavy again. Bishnu stepped toward the stairs, his bare feet slapping softly against the red oxide, the sound echoing in the hollow space of the house. As he reached the first step of the wooden staircase, the tapping stopped. The man on the balcony finally looked down, his gaze sharp and assessing, as if Bishnu were merely another architectural detail to be noted and sketched. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer a greeting. He simply adjusted his glasses with a flick of his finger and spoke in a voice that was clipped, precise, and entirely devoid of the house's lethargy. The perspective from the landing is slightly off, but the way the light hits the red oxide at 4 o'clock is mathematically perfect, the man said. The cotton fold. The perspective from the landing is slightly off, but the way the light hits the red oxide at 4 o'clock is mathematically perfect, the man said. Bishnu stopped his ascent on the third step, the wood groaning beneath his heel. He didn't answer immediately. He watched the man, Siddhartha Bose, though the name hadn't yet been spoken, who remained perched on the mahogany railing like a heron, his pencil scratching a frantic, precise rhythm against the paper. The stranger's voice had a surgical quality to it, a sharpness that sliced right through the heavy, humid blanket of the afternoon. It was the sound of a city clock ticking in a room meant for dreaming. Bishnu felt the familiar tightening in his shoulders, the ghost of the tea-stall rush where every second was a transaction and every delay a failure. "Who are you?" Bishnu asked. His voice was low, the words spaced out by long, cautious pauses. He didn't move further up the stairs. He stayed in the shadow of the landing, observing the way the man's thick-rimmed glasses caught the gray light of the monsoon sky. The man finally lowered the sketchbook, glancing at Bishnu not as a person, but as a geometric variable. He adjusted his glasses with a sharp flick of his middle finger. "Siddhartha, a cousin. Third remove, perhaps. I'm documenting the structural integrity of the ancestral lines before the damp claims the lime plaster. Your grandmother gave me the key." Bishnu blinked. He looked toward the kitchen, where the faint rhythmic hum of Kalyani's singing still drifted through the house. The idea that she had invited a surveyor of silence into the home without a word to him felt like a small, quiet breach of trust. He wanted to demand an explanation, to ask why this clinical energy was allowed to vibrate within the sanctuary, but the tension in his chest felt too heavy to carry up the stairs. He needed to move, not toward the confrontation, but away from the friction. He stepped back down the wooden stairs, his bare feet finding the cool, familiar grip of the red oxide floor. He didn't look back at Siddhartha, whose pencil had already returned to the page with a renewed, aggressive precision. He wandered toward the back of the house, seeking the deep, shadowed lungs of the building. He found himself in the pantry, a long, narrow room where the air smelled of dried chilies, turmeric, and the ancient sweet musk of old wood. There, Gauri Mukherjee was standing by the spice shelves. She wasn't just organizing, she was performing a liturgy. She held a jar of cinnamon sticks in her hand, rotating it slowly, aligning the label with a precision that felt meditative rather than clinical. Her movements were fluid, devoid of the jagged edges that Siddhartha had brought into the house. She didn't look up as he entered, but a small, knowing smile touched the corners of her eyes. "The rain has a way of pushing people into the corners of the house," Gauri said, her voice soft and airy, trailing off into a contented sigh. She finally turned to him, her gaze warm. "You look as though you are still carrying the noise of the railway station in your marrow, Bishnu." Bishnu rubbed his thumbs together in a slow, anxious circle. "There is a man on the balcony, a cousin. He is sketching the house as if it were a blueprint for a machine." Gauri let out a hum, a sound of mild amusement. She didn't seem bothered by the intruder. Instead, she gestured toward a heavy teak table in the center of the room, where a mountain of linens lay in a pale, cream-colored heap. "Let the architect have his lines. For now, the linens need the hands of a person who knows how to be still. Help me." She handed him a stack of cool, heavy cotton sheets. The fabric was thick, smelling of sun-dried cedar and a hint of something metal sharp, like a rain-washed coin. Instinctively, Bishnu gripped the edges of the first sheet and snapped it taut with a sharp, violent motion, the fabric cracking like a whip in the small room. He began to fold it with a brisk, mechanical efficiency, corner to corner, crease to crease, trying to finish the task as quickly as possible. His fingers twitched, driven by a city-bred need to clear the queue, to optimize the movement, to move on to the next thing. Gauri's hand moved with surprising speed, her fingers closing gently but firmly over his wrist. Her touch was light, but it stopped his momentum entirely. "Stop," she whispered. "You are fighting the cloth." Bishnu paused, his breath catching. He studied her, then down at the sheet, which was now bunched and wrinkled from his haste. "The fabric has its own memory," Gauri explained, her voice a slow, rhythmic tide. "If you force it, it will always hold the wrinkle of your anger. You must let it settle." She took the sheet from him and laid it flat across the teak table. She didn't snap it. Instead, she smoothed it with the palms of her hands, a slow, sweeping motion that seemed to iron out not just the fabric, but the air around them. She showed him how to lift the edge slowly, allowing the weight of the cotton to dictate the fold. She guided his hands, forcing him to slow his pulse to match the rhythm of the weave. Bishnu closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on the tactile sensation. He felt the grit of the heavy weave against his skin, the coolness of the fiber, and the way the fabric resisted and then surrendered. He stopped thinking about the man on the balcony and the ticking of the city clock. He focused only on the dry sound of cotton sliding against cotton. It was a hypnotic noise, a white noise that began to dissolve the tension in his forearms. He felt his shoulders drop an inch, then two. The act of folding became a prayer of repetition, a slow subtraction of urgency. They worked in a shared silence for a long time. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic drumming of the rain on the corrugated roof and the soft, rhythmic sliding of the linens. Gauri's presence was like a steady anchor, her breathing slow and deep. Eventually, she let out a long, resonant sigh, a sound of total surrender to the moment that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floorboards and into the soles of Bishnu's feet. It was a signal that the work was not a chore to be finished, but a state to be inhabited. As he reached for the final sheet, Bishnu's gaze drifted to the far corner of the pantry. Tucked behind a stack of oversized metal tang pots was a small, forgotten chest. It was made of dark, heavy rosewood, but it was almost entirely obscured by a thick gray velvet of dust. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades, a silent witness to the house's long hibernation. There was something about the way it sat in the shadows, a heavy, brooding presence that didn't fit the lightness of the linens. Intrigued, Bishnu stepped toward it, his hand reaching out to brush away the dust. He wondered if it held old letters, or perhaps the forgotten spices of a previous generation. Just as his fingertips were an inch from the wood, Gauri's voice cut through the silence, though she hadn't moved from the table. "Leave it be, Bishnu," she whispered, her tone shifting from warmth to a sudden guarded stillness. Bishnu froze, his hand hovering in the air. He looked back at Gauri. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was watching the chest with a look of profound, quiet caution. "Some things in this house," she continued, her voice barely audible over the rain, "are meant to stay exactly where they are." Links, the golden viscosity. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a walking stick echoed through the hallway, a sound that didn't just signal an arrival, but announced it with the authority of a church bell. It was a slow, deliberate cadence, punctuating the silence of the house and pulling Bishnu's attention away from the rosewood chest and Gauri's sudden, fragile tension. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the red oxide floors, until a voice boomed from the entryway, a deep, resonant bass that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Bishnu's bones. "Kalyani, I have brought the gold of the earth, and I have brought the stories of the wind." Chaitanya Roy entered the pantry area not so much as a man, but as a force of nature. He was draped in a heavy, rain-dampened shawl that smelled of wet wool and distant forests. In his arms he cradled a large earthen pot, its mouth sealed tightly with a piece of coarse, oil-stained muslin tied with a hemp string. Even before the pot was set down, the scent reached Bishnu, a thick primal sweetness, like burnt caramel and damp earth, a smell that felt less like a fragrance and more like a memory of something ancient. Chaitanya didn't immediately hand over the prize. Instead, he leaned heavily on his umbrella, his eyes twinkling behind thick lenses. He watched Bishnu, then at Gauri, then at the ceiling, as if checking the atmospheric pressure of the room. He set the pot down on the wooden table with a muffled clink, but his hands remained resting on the clay rim, claiming the space. "The harvest this year, Bishnu, you remember me, yes? The boy who used to hide in the mango groves. The harvest is a temperamental thing," Chaitanya began. He didn't start at the beginning. He started in the middle of a thought that seemed to have begun 3 days prior. He began to describe the date palm trees, not as plants, but as stubborn elders who refused to yield their sap until the moon reached a unnamed phase of silver. His voice was a slow, sweeping current. He spoke of a particular tree on the edge of the village, a tree that had been struck by lightning 40 years ago and now grew in a spiral, producing a syrup that tasted of smoke and midnight. He wandered into a tangent about the man who climbed that tree, a man with a missing toe and a penchant for reciting Tagore to the birds, and how that man had once lost a bet involving a goat and a very expensive silk umbrella. Bishnu found himself sliding down the side of a supporting pillar, his back pressing against the cool, damp plaster. He felt the phantom ticking of the city clock in his wrist begin to fade. In the city, a story was a delivery system for information. Here, with Chaitanya, the story was the destination. He watched Chaitanya's hands, large, weathered hands that moved in slow, sweeping arcs, as if he were painting the air with the narrative. Bishnu's thumbs began to rub together in a slow, rhythmic friction, syncing himself to the cadence of the man's voice. He wasn't just listening to a story about jaggery, he was being lured into a different perception of time, where a 20-minute detour into the history of a village goat was not a waste, but a necessary ornament of the afternoon. Outside, the rain shifted gears. The gentle drumming turned into a violent assault, a sudden deluge that hammered against the corrugated roof with a metal-sharp roar. The sound effectively sealed the pantry, turning the room into a warm, dimly lit cocoon. The world beyond the walls ceased to exist. There was only the scent of the earthen pot, the drumming of the rain, and the resonance of Chaitanya's voice. Gauri had relaxed her guard, her shoulders dropping as she leaned against the counter, her eyes half closed, drifting on the current of the conversation. "And so," Chaitanya said, his voice dropping an octave, the story finally circling back to the present with the slow grace of a hunting hawk. The sap was drawn in the hour before the first light, while the fog was still thick enough to swallow a man whole. With a deliberate, slow motion, Chaitanya reached for the hemp string. He untied the knot with a patience that felt almost liturgical. As he peeled back the muslin cloth, the scent of the Nolan gur exploded into the room, a rich, heady aroma that felt heavy enough to touch. Bishnu leaned in. Inside the pot was the Nolan gur date palm jaggery in its purest, liquid form. It was a thick, golden-brown viscosity that seemed to catch and hold the dim, amber light of the pantry. As Chaitanya tilted the pot slightly, the syrup shifted. It didn't splash or ripple. It flowed in a slow-motion cascade, a heavy, luxurious slide that defied the rushing chaos of the rain outside. It looked like molten amber, a substance that existed in its own time frame, moving with a dignified, syrupy reluctance. Bishnu was mesmerized. He watched a single bubble rise to the surface and vanish with agonizing slowness. He felt a strange, pulsing warmth in his chest, a sense of profound alignment. The syrup was the physical manifestation of the house, thick, slow, and deeply rooted in the earth. For a moment, the mystery of the rosewood chest and the clinical presence of Siddhartha on the balcony felt like distant, irrelevant noise. There was only this golden flow. As the light began to fade, turning the corners of the pantry into deep violet shadows, the conversation shifted. The booming volume of Chaitanya's voice softened into something low and intimate. He and Gauri began to speak in shorthand, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of shared history. They spoke of the monsoons of the 70s, of the way the house used to smell when the night bloom scent bloomed in the courtyard, and of the people who had walked these red oxide floors and vanished into the fog of time. Bishnu listened, feeling the weight of the ancestry pressing down on him, not as a burden, but as a blanket. He felt a kinship with the silence that lived between their words. However, as Chaitanya prepared to leave, he paused, his hand lingering on the rim of the pot. His expression shifted, a flicker of something like regret crossing his weathered features. "It is the finest batch in 3 seasons," Chaitanya whispered, his voice now a raspy hum. "But it is still incomplete. There is a missing ingredient, a blend of cardamom and wild ginger that only grows in the shade of the northern ridge. It hasn't been found, or rather, it hasn't been harvested since the last great monsoon. The kind of rain that washes away the roads and the memories alike." He studied the pot, and then his gaze drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the corner where the rosewood chest sat under its shroud of gray dust. "Without it," Chaitanya added, his voice trailing off into a sigh, "the sweetness is perfect, but the soul of the sweet remains dormant. A lock without a key." He didn't explain further. He simply gathered his umbrella, gave a slow, sweeping nod to Gauri, and stepped back out into the rain. The thud of his walking stick receded down the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Bishnu looked at the golden syrup, then at the rosewood chest. The rain continued to scream against the roof, and for the first time, the sanctuary felt less like a refuge and more like a riddle. The geometry of silence. The graphite pencil scratched against the heavy vellum with a sound like a dry insect burrowing into wood. Bishnu found Siddhartha on the veranda, hunched over a wide drawing board that looked entirely too clinical for the softened edges of the house. He wasn't sketching the ornate cornices or the peeling lime wash of the pillars. Instead, he was drawing a series of intersecting vectors and sharp, intersecting lines that sliced through the space of the courtyard. The lines were aggressive, mathematical, an attempt to cage the air itself in a grid of graphite. Bishnu stopped a few feet away, his thumbs rubbing together in a slow, rhythmic circle. He didn't speak immediately, letting the sound of the rain, now a steady, drumming percussion on the corrugated roof, fill the gap. Siddhartha didn't look up, but his pencil accelerated, the tip snapping slightly under the pressure of a particularly rigid angle. He adjusted his glasses with a quick, jerky motion of his middle finger. His eyes narrowed as if he were staring at a complex equation rather than a rainy afternoon. "You're mapping the house?" Bishnu said, his voice low, the words spaced far apart. Siddhartha finally paused, his pencil hovering a millimeter above the paper. He didn't turn his head, but his shoulders remained tight, pulled up toward his ears. "Not the house, exactly. I'm mapping the geometry of the silence. If you look at the way the sound of the rain hits the inner courtyard and then dissipates toward the back hallway, there's a structural logic to it. Peace isn't an accident, Bishnu. It's a spatial arrangement. If I can isolate the variables, the height of the ceilings, the density of the walls, the angle of the eaves, I can understand why this place feels the way it does." Bishnu tilted his head, listening. He looked past Siddhartha toward the courtyard, where the rain had turned the center of the house into a shimmering liquid mirror. The edges of the pillars were blurring, the gray stone bleeding into the gray sky. To Siddhartha, the silence was a problem to be solved, a puzzle of architecture and acoustics. But to Bishnu, the silence felt like something else entirely. It felt like a heavy, damp blanket, a physical presence that occupied the room just as surely as the furniture did. It wasn't a void, it was a substance, thick as the Nolan Gur syrup they had stirred earlier, filling the lungs and slowing the heartbeat. Siddhartha suddenly let out a sharp huff of frustration. He gripped the eraser and scrubbed a line away with a violent, snapping motion, leaving a smudge of gray ghost lines across the vellum. "It's not working," he muttered, his voice clipped. "I can get the proportions of the veranda right. I can map the echo. But the actual feeling of the air, that specific, heavy stillness, it refuses to translate into a drawing. It's as if the house is shifting its dimensions the moment I try to pin them down." Bishnu stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the smudge of graphite. He thought of the city, the jagged noise of the tea stalls, and the screaming horns of the taxis that had lived in his marrow for years. For a long time, he had believed that silence was merely the absence of noise. But here, in the cooling humidity of the ancestral home, he realized that silence had a weight. It had a texture, like old silk or wet earth. He wondered if Siddhartha was trying to measure a river with a ruler, oblivious to the fact that the water was flowing around him, soaking into his skin. He is treating this place like a specimen under a microscope, Bishnu thought. He wants to dissect the piece to see how it works, not realizing that the act of dissection kills the thing he is trying to preserve. He is searching for a formula for stillness, while he is vibrating with the tension of a coiled spring. How can you map a sanctuary when you are treating it like a laboratory? "Stop looking at the walls," Bishnu said softly. He leaned against the cool red oxide pillar, the dampness of the air clinging to his skin. Listen to the gaps between the raindrops. Not the sound of the water hitting the stone, but the silence that happens in the heartbeat between one drop and the next. Siddhartha looked at him then, his expression skeptical, his pencil still gripped tightly in his hand. "That's not a technical observation, Bishnu. That's poetry." "Maybe the house is written in poetry," Bishnu replied, a small, slow smile touching his lips. "You can't calculate the weight of a memory with a drafting square." Siddhartha stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered the pencil. He didn't put it down, but he stopped the aggressive scratching. He shifted his weight, his rigid posture beginning to sag, the tension in his neck easing as he mirrored Bishnu's stillness. They sat together in a long, shared silence. For several minutes, neither spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the monsoon and the occasional drip of water from a leaking gutter, landing with a heavy plink in a puddle below. As the minutes stretched, the air seemed to thicken. The pressure of the silence pressed against them, warm and enveloping. Bishnu noticed Siddhartha's breathing change. The short, shallow breaths of a man on a deadline transitioned into a slow, deep cadence. The artist's grip on the pencil loosened. His fingers, previously white-knuckled, relaxed into a natural curve. Siddhartha turned back to his paper, but he didn't return to the grids. He didn't draw a single straight line. Instead, his hand began to move in fluid, sweeping arcs. He stopped sketching the architecture and began to sketch the steam rising from a forgotten cup of tea on the side table, the way the vapor curled and spiraled into the humid air, mimicking the slow drift of the rain outside. The lines were no longer sharp. They were soft, drifting, almost hesitant. He was no longer mapping a building, he was tracing a mood. For a moment, a bridge formed between them, a mutual understanding born not of words, but of a shared surrender to the lethargy of the afternoon. They were two men suspended in the same amber moment, the city and its demands feeling like a dream from a previous life. Bishnu felt a sudden, sharp kinship with this man, this analytical cousin who had come to the house as a conqueror of space and was slowly being defeated by the atmosphere. Then Siddhartha froze. His pencil stopped mid-curve, his body locking back into a state of high alert. He wasn't looking at his drawing anymore. His gaze was fixed on the far corner of the courtyard, where the shadows of the overgrown ferns pooled against the gray stone. "Bishnu," Siddhartha whispered, his voice losing its clip and becoming thin. "Tell me I'm imagining that." Bishnu followed his gaze. In the dim violet light of the corner, the shadows seemed to be shifting. It wasn't the wind, the ferns were still. It wasn't the light. The clouds were a solid, unchanging shroud. Something in the darkness was moving independently of the light, a slow, undulating ripple in the gloom that didn't belong to the geometry of the house. It was a smudge of movement, a presence that felt heavy and wrong, sliding silently across the red oxide floor toward the interior of the sanctuary. Wait. The shadow in the courtyard did not vanish, it simply dissolved into the gray architecture, leaving a residue of coldness that clung to the skin. Bishnu did not speak of it, and neither did Siddhartha. Instead, they retreated. They moved backward, away from the open balcony, and into the deep, humming heart of the house, where the smell of damp earth was replaced by the scent of old wood and something faintly metal-sharp. They found Kalyani in the kitchen, a room that felt like a temple dedicated to the slow passage of time. The light here was a thick, buttery gold, filtered through a high, grime-streaked window. In the center of the room, a heavy brass pot sat atop a low, burning fire, the flames licking the blackened bottom of the vessel with a soft, rhythmic hiss. Kalyani did not look up as they entered, but she shifted her weight, making room for Bishnu beside her. She pointed a gnarled finger toward the pot. The brass was scarred, its surface a map of 1,000 previous meals. "The water," she murmured, her voice like dry parchment rubbing together. "Watch it. Do not look at the clock. Look at the water." Bishnu stepped forward, his shoulders still tight from the tension of the courtyard. He looked into the pot. The water was still, a dark mirror reflecting the rafters above, but tiny, microscopic bubbles were beginning to cling to the sides, like a string of pearls rising slowly toward the surface. "You want it to boil," Kalyani said, not as a question, but as an observation. She had seen the way he shifted his weight, the way his fingers twitched with the ghost habit of the city, where tea was a commodity produced in a rush of steam and noise. In the city, you chase the boil. You want the violence of the bubble so you can move to the next thing. Here, we wait for the shiver. Bishnu leaned in. He could feel the heat radiating against his cheeks, a dry, honest warmth. He watched the water intently. He wanted to reach for the dial of the stove, to nudge the flame higher, to force the water into that frantic, rolling boil he had known for years. The urge was a physical itch in his palms, a residue of the hurried crowds and the ticking meters of his former life. He felt the sudden, sharp impulse to speed the world up, to resolve the silence of the house with the familiar chaos of activity. But just as his hand moved, Kalyani's palm landed on his shoulder. Her touch was light, but her hand was steady, a grounding weight that seemed to anchor him to the red oxide floor. "Wait," she hummed. "The leaf cannot open if the water is angry. It must be shivering. Just on the edge of a scream, but not yet screaming." Bishnu froze. He forced his breath to slow, mirroring the rhythm of the rain hitting the courtyard tiles outside. He watched the water. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was only seconds. The distinction felt irrelevant in the golden dimness of the kitchen. Then it happened. The water didn't break into bubbles. Instead, it began to tremble. A fine, high-frequency vibration rippled across the surface, a shimmering tension that looked like silk being pulled taut. It was the shiver. "Now," Kalyani whispered. Bishnu reached for the tin of tea leaves. He added a handful, and as they hit the water, he leaned in closer. He watched the leaves descend, then slowly, agonizingly, begin to unfurl. It was a miniature ballet of amber and green, the dried curls expanding in the heat, stretching their limbs in a slow-motion awakening. He felt his own chest loosen. The tightness that had lived between his shoulder blades since he left the city began to dissolve, melting away into the steam. He realized he was no longer thinking about the shadow in the courtyard, or the deadlines of the world outside. He was thinking only of the leaf. "Why have I spent 10 years fighting the clock?" The thought spiked through him, sudden and piercing. I have treated time as an enemy to be outrun, a distance to be closed. I have brewed 1,000 pots of tea, but I have never actually seen the tea happen. I have been a ghost in my own life, rushing from one ghost task to another, believing that the arrival was the point. But the arrival is always just another starting line. The only thing that is real is this shiver, this exact, trembling moment before the boil. He felt a strange, floating sensation, as if the gravity of the house had shifted. The ticking of the heavy mahogany clock on the wall became a distant, unimportant sound, eventually fading entirely, replaced by the rhythmic, hypnotic bubble of the simmer. The sound was a heartbeat, slow and deep, echoing the pulse of the rain. The kitchen seemed to expand, the walls receding into a warm, golden haze. The air grew thick with the aroma of the brewing tea, a rich, earthy scent that acted like a blanket, muffling the echoes of city sirens and shouting vendors that still occasionally flickered in the back of his mind. Behind him, the floorboards creaked. Siddhartha entered the room. He didn't speak, he didn't ask about the water or the timing. He looked exhausted, his glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. Without a word, he walked to the heavy wooden table and placed his sketchbook on the surface. He didn't open it, he didn't reach for his pencil. He simply leaned against the table and closed his eyes, tilting his head back to let the steam rise around him. He looked as though he had finally stopped trying to map the silence and had decided, for the first time, to simply inhabit it. Bishnu watched his cousin. He saw the way Siddhartha's jaw had finally unclenched, the way the analytical tension had leaked out of his frame. They were two men defeated by a pot of tea, surrendered to the lethargy of a rainy afternoon. Bishnu felt a surge of tenderness for the man, a kinship born of shared exhaustion. They were both learners here, students of a slow art that required nothing but the willingness to be still. The destination, Kalyani said, her voice a soft rasp, is not the cup. The destination is the waiting. Bishnu nodded, though he didn't know if he had heard her. He felt the weight of the moment, the sheer, heavy presence of the present. He reached for the cups, heavy, ceramic things with chipped rims, and carefully began to pour. He poured slowly, a thin, steady stream of liquid gold falling into the vessels. But as the tea filled the first cup, Bishnu stopped. He blinked, leaning closer to the light. The liquid in the pot had not turned the expected deep amber of a traditional brew. Instead, as the light from the high window hit the surface, the tea shimmered with an unexpected, iridescent hue. It was a pale, luminous violet, swirling with metal-sharp streaks of silver, as if the water had captured a piece of the twilight sky from the courtyard. It was beautiful, and it was entirely impossible. The caramelized breath. Bishnu didn't pour the tea. He held the pot suspended in midair, the spout hovering just an inch above the rim of the ceramic cup, frozen by the impossible sight of the liquid. The violet shimmer was not a trick of the light or a reflection of the curtains. It was a living, pulsing hue, swirling with silver threads that looked like molten mercury. Beside him, Siddhartha had opened one eye, his gaze shifting from the ceiling to the pot. For a moment, the analytical precision of the artist clashed with the surrealism of the brew. Siddhartha's glasses slid further down his nose, but he didn't push them up. He simply stared, his breath hitching in a way that suggested he was trying to calculate the refractive index of a miracle. "It is the rain," Kalyani said, her voice a low, dry rasp that sounded like old silk being unfolded. She didn't look at the pot. She was already moving toward the heavy iron stove, her cotton cerise pelou draped carefully over her shoulder. "Some afternoons, the house remembers things we have forgotten. Don't let the color distract you from the heat. The tea is still tea, and the hunger is still hunger." Bishnu slowly set the pot back on the trivet. The violet glow seemed to settle, receding into a deep, conventional amber as if it had been shy. He rubbed his thumbs together, a slow, rhythmic friction that usually grounded him, but his pulse remained erratic. He studied the steam rising in lazy curls, then back at his grandmother. She was already reaching for a heavy, blackened brass pot, the kind that had likely seen a century of fires. The transition was abrupt, yet seamless. The mystery of the tea was not dismissed, but simply shelved in favor of a more immediate, tactile necessity. "The Nolinger," Kalyani murmured, gesturing to a clay jar sealed with a piece of dampened cloth. "The date palm sap is a fickle thing, Bishnu. It does not want to be rushed. It wants to be coaxed. If you fight it, it turns bitter. If you ignore it, it burns. You must breed with it." Bishnu stepped forward, the red oxide floor cool beneath his feet. He watched as Kalyani scooped a generous portion of the golden-brown jaggery into the pot. The scent hit him immediately. A deep, fermented sweetness, reminiscent of damp earth, toasted vanilla, and something ancient, like the smell of a library bound in leather and honey. As the heat from the stove began to penetrate the brass, the jaggery didn't just melt, it sighed. It collapsed into a thick, viscous pool that shimmered under the dim glow of the kitchen lamps. "Take the spoon," she commanded softly. Bishnu reached for the long wooden stir, its handle smoothed by decades of palms. He dipped it into the syrup and began to move. Following the same hypnotic clockwise motion Kalyani had demonstrated a dozen times since his arrival, he started to stir. At first his movement was tentative, the city's frantic energy still ghosting through his wrists. He was thinking about the timing, about the exact degree of the circle, about the outcome. He felt the tension in his shoulders, a phantom weight that had followed him from the tea stalls of the city into the sanctuary of the home. "You are stirring the sugar, but you are not stirring the air," Kalyani observed, her voice humming. She stood beside him, not touching him, but her presence was a steady anchor. "Match your breath to the wood. Inhale as you push the syrup toward the edge. Exhale as you pull it back to the center. Become the circle, Bishnu. The pot is not a tool, it is a clock. And right now, the only time that exists is the time it takes for the sugar to change its mind." Bishnu closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, focusing entirely on the amber swirl. He began to breathe. In. The spoon pushed the heavy syrup against the curve of the brass. Out. The syrup flowed back, a slow, golden tide. The rhythm began to take hold of him, a somatic loop that bypassed his intellect. The sounds of the house, the distant drip of a leak in the hallway, the muffled scratching of Siddhartha's pencil in the other room began to fade. There was only the heat of the stove against his shins and the intoxicating, thickening aroma of the caramelizing sugar. As the temperature rose, the scent evolved. It moved from the raw, earthy smell of the sap into something more sophisticated, a rich, toasted fragrance that felt all-encompassing. It wasn't just a smell, it was a texture. It filled his lungs like a warm blanket, coating the back of his throat with a phantom sweetness. He felt a strange, floating sensation, a trance-like state where the boundaries of his own body seemed to blur. He was no longer a man in a kitchen in North Kolkata. He was a continuation of a process, a link in a chain of hands that had performed this exact dance for generations. "Listen," Kalyani whispered. "Stop thinking. Just listen." Bishnu paused his breathing for a heartbeat and tilted his head. At first he heard nothing but the rain. Then he heard it, a soft popping hiss. It wasn't a violent boil, but a delicate, rhythmic series of sighs, like 1,000 tiny bubbles bursting in a slow-motion sequence. It was the sound of the syrup reaching its critical point, the precise moment where the sugar transformed into something crystalline and glossy. "The sound is the thermometer," she said, a hint of a smile in her raspy tone. "If the hiss becomes a scream, you have gone too far. If it is a whisper, it is not yet ready. You are looking for the psalm of the gold." Bishnu watched as the syrup reached a perfect, mirror-like sheen. The amber glow of the kitchen lamps reflected on the surface of the liquid, creating a shimmering pool of light that looked like a captured sunset. He felt a profound surge of kinship, not just with his grandmother, but with the ghosts of the women who had stood exactly where he was standing. He could almost feel their shoulders brushing against his, their breath syncing with his own, their hands guiding the spoon in that same eternal, clockwise rotation. The domesticity of the act felt sacred, a ritual of patience in a world that had forgotten how to wait. He was so deep in the meditative drift, so attuned to the popping hiss of the sugar, that the world outside the kitchen had ceased to exist. He was suspended in a golden amber vacuum, a sanctuary of scent and sound. He felt the tension finally leave his jaw, his shoulders dropping an inch as he surrendered completely to the lethargy of the afternoon. For the first time in years, the noise in his head, the sirens, the shouting, the relentless pressure of the city was silent. Then the silence was murdered. From the courtyard, a sudden violent crash echoed through the house. It was the sound of something heavy ceramic or stone shattering against the red oxide floor. The noise ripped through the kitchen like a physical blow, snapping the trance instantly. Bishnu jerked back, the wooden spoon clattering against the rim of the pot, sending a spray of molten gold across the stovetop. The suddenness of the sound felt wrong, an intruder in a space that had just achieved a fragile, perfect peace. He stood frozen, his chest heaving, as the echo of the crash lingered in the humid air, leaving a void where the music of the sugar had been. Amber glow. The shards of the ceramic pot lay like a jagged constellation across the red oxide floor, the spilled syrup bleeding into the porous stone in a slow, viscous tide. Bishnu stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his chest still heaving, the smell of burnt sugar clinging to his skin like a second layer of clothing. He looked down at the wooden spoon in his hand, then at the splatters of molten gold on the stove. The piece he had just found, that fragile amber vacuum, hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered. "It was only a pot, Bishnu. The sugar still lives," Kalyani said, her voice a raspy, comforting hum that seemed to pull the air back into his lungs. She didn't look at the mess. Instead, she reached out and steadied his wrist, her touch like dry parchment, grounding him. She guided him away from the wreckage, her movements slow and deliberate, as if any sudden gesture might further disturb the equilibrium of the house. They migrated toward the living room, where the dim light of the afternoon had curdled into a deep, saturated gold. The red oxide floors here were polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the amber glow of the lamps in long, shimmering streaks that looked like rivers of honey. Siddhartha Bose was already there, perched on the edge of a heavy teak chair, his sketchbook forgotten on his lap. He looked as though he had been caught in a trance, his glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. Beside him, Gauri Mukherjee was arranging a tray of brass plates with a rhythmic precision that felt almost liturgical, her fingers dancing over the metal without a sound. "The rain has a way of bringing things down," Siddhartha remarked, his voice clipped but lacking its usual analytical edge. He didn't mention the crash, he simply watched the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air. He seemed smaller in the amber light, the rigid architecture of his posture finally beginning to soften, as if the house were slowly absorbing him into its own lethargy. Kalyani placed the tray of Nolan Gur sweets in the center of the low table. They were small, glistening spheres of pale gold, smelling of damp earth, toasted salt, and a deep floral sweetness that seemed to vibrate in the back of the throat. Bishnu took one, the texture yielding beneath his teeth with a slow, creamy resistance. The flavor was an unfolding map of the region, the musk of the date palms, the mineral tang of the river silt, and a sweetness so concentrated it felt like a physical weight. He chewed slowly, rubbing his thumbs together, feeling the city's frantic rhythm finally decouple from his heartbeat. "The best batches always come after a storm," Gauri whispered, her voice trailing off into a contented sigh. She didn't look at him, but her smile was visible in the soft crinkle of her eyes. She began to move around the room, her movements fluid and unobtrusive, like a shadow drifting through a dream. As the minutes stretched, a heavy, warm drowsiness began to cloud Bishnu's awareness. It wasn't the exhaustion of the city, that jagged, caffeine-fueled fatigue that left the nerves raw, but a somatic release, a slow melting of the muscles he hadn't realized he was bracing. He felt his jaw loosen, the chronic tension in his trapezius muscles dissolving into the red oxide floor. It was as if the house were a giant, warm lung, and he was simply breathing in time with it. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was thick, like the syrup they had just tasted, filled with the unspoken understanding of people who had spent decades sharing the same air. Conversation became a luxury they could no longer afford. When Siddhartha spoke, it was in half-finished sentences, his thoughts drifting away before they could be fully formed. "The light, it almost looks liquid," he murmured, his voice sounding distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. Kalyani hummed in response, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in the floorboards. She leaned back in her chair, her cotton sari paloo draped loosely over her shoulder, her eyes half closed. The rhythmic, clockwise motion of her stirring in the kitchen had transitioned into a rhythmic, slow blink in the living room. Bishnu watched the steam rise from his final cup of tea. The vapor didn't dissipate quickly. Instead, it curled in the heavy air like slow-motion ribbons, weaving intricate, ephemeral patterns that mirrored the sketches in Siddhartha's book. He found himself mesmerized by the movement, his mind refusing to categorize or analyze. He was simply observing the drift. The sound of the rain had shifted too. The violent drumming on the corrugated roof had faded into a whisper, a rhythmic lullaby that pulled at his eyelids with an irresistible weight. He tried to remember the sound of a car horn. He tried to conjure the smell of diesel fumes and the sight of 1,000 hurried faces in the Kolkata metro. He found that he couldn't. The memories were there, but they were distant, like photographs left in the sun until the images had bleached white. They had been completely replaced by the house's hum, the ticking of the grandfather clock, the soft rustle of Gauri's sari, and the steady, meditative pulse of the rain. "Time to dim the world," Gauri whispered. She began to move through the room, extinguishing the lamps one by one. The amber glow retreated, shrinking into smaller and smaller circles of light until the room sank into a soft, golden twilight. The shadows grew long and velvet-like, blurring the edges of the furniture and the people. Bishnu felt himself slipping further into the drift, his consciousness hovering just above the surface of sleep, floating in a sea of date palm sweetness and red oxide warmth. He felt a sudden, instinctive need to move, a residual flicker of the city man who feared standing still for too long. He pushed himself up from the low table, his movements sluggish, as if he were moving through water. His limbs felt heavy, saturated with the peace of the house, but as he straightened his back, the atmosphere of the room shifted abruptly. Across the room, a heavy mahogany window frame stood open, the casement swinging slightly on a rusted hinge. He didn't remember it being open. In fact, he was certain Kalyani had bolted the house against the damp. A sudden, sharp draft of cold air swept through the room, cutting through the amber warmth like a knife. It carried with it the scent of wet stone and something metal sharp, something clinical. Bishnu shivered, the warmth of the Nolan Gur evaporating from his skin in an instant. He looked toward the window, where the darkness of the courtyard pressed against the glass, and saw a single wet footprint printed clearly on the interior sill, the mud still glistening in the dying light. The heavy quilt? Bishnu didn't move from the windowsill, his gaze locked on the glistening mud of the footprint. The clinical scent, sharp, like a hospital corridor or a freshly opened bottle of rubbing alcohol, clashed violently with the lingering sweetness of the Nolan Gur. He could feel the cold air from the open casement licking at his neck, a sudden intrusion of the outside world into the velvet sanctuary Kalyani had cultivated. Beside him, Gauri had frozen, her hand still hovering near the last lamp she had extinguished. The silence that followed was not the meditative peace of the afternoon, but a brittle, expectant thing. "Who could have come in?" Bishnu asked, his voice low and melodic, though it carried a tremor he couldn't quite suppress. He didn't look at Gauri, he kept his eyes on the print. It was too precise, too deliberate for a stray animal, and too fresh to have been left by anyone currently in the house. "The bolts were thrown," Gauri whispered, her voice trailing off into a sigh of genuine confusion. She stepped closer, her cotton saree rustling softly against the red oxide floor. She didn't touch the mud, but she leaned in, her brow furrowed. "I saw Kalyani slide the iron bar myself. It is impossible for someone to have entered without a key or a broken pane." Bishnu slowly rubbed his thumbs together, the repetitive motion a subconscious attempt to anchor himself. He looked up at the ceiling, thinking of the balcony, thinking of the stranger he had glimpsed earlier, the man with the mathematical sketches and the clipped precision. The house, which had felt like a womb only moments ago, now felt porous. The boundaries between the ancestral safety of the interior and the chaotic damp of the Kolkata rain had been blurred. He felt a sudden, irrational need to check the locks on every door to seal the house back into its silent, amber shell. "Go to the kitchen," Bishnu told her, though it sounded more like a request than a command. "Tell Didima that the window was open. I will check the courtyard." Gauri nodded, her movements cautious, as if the air itself had become fragile. As she retreated, her footsteps echoing softly down the corridor, Bishnu remained by the window. He reached out and slowly pushed the casement shut, the rusted hinge letting out a long, mournful groan that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He slid the bolt home with a definitive metal-sharp click, but the clinical scent lingered, a ghost in the room that refused to be evicted. He stood there for a long time, listening to the rain resume its drumming on the corrugated roof, wondering if the intruder was still within the walls, or if they had vanished back into the gray mist of the alleys. Eventually, the adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The tension of the city, which he had thought he'd shed upon arrival, had merely been dormant, and this small breach had acted as a catalyst, pulling the last of his reserves. He walked toward his bedroom, his feet heavy on the cool floors. The house had returned to its hum, the distant ticking of the grandfather clock and the muffled sound of Kalyani humming a tune in the kitchen, but the rhythm had changed. It was no longer a simple lullaby. It was a slow, steady pulse that demanded he surrender to it. When he entered his room, the air was thick with the scent of dried spices, cloves, and cinnamon, and the static crackle of the rainwater. The bed waited for him, a wide, sturdy piece of teak furniture that had likely held 3 generations of Ganguly men. As he sank into the mattress, it yielded to his weight with a soft, welcoming sigh, the springs creaking in a familiar, comforting cadence. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling where the shadows of the rain-streaked window danced in the dim light. He felt as though he were sinking into the earth itself, the heavy mahogany of the bed anchoring him to the house. There was a soft knock, and Gowrie entered, carrying a heavy, hand-stitched quilt. It was a masterpiece of domestic labor, a dense tapestry of cotton and wool in muted earth tones. She didn't speak, knowing that Bishnu's silence was a sanctuary he was currently rebuilding. With a slow, rhythmic precision, she settled the quilt over him. The weight of the fabric was immediate and absolute, acting like a physical embrace that pressed him deeper into the mattress. It was a weight that didn't burden, but rather protected, shielding him from the cold draft and the lingering uncertainty of the open window. "Sleep now," Gowrie whispered, her eyes smiling even as her voice remained airy and tentative. "The rain will wash the world clean by morning." She stepped back and exited, closing the door with a click that sounded like a final period at the end of a long sentence. Bishnu lay beneath the quilt, feeling the warmth begin to bloom across his chest. In the distance, the low, resonant toll of a temple bell drifted through the rain. The tone was long and stretching, a single, golden thread of sound that vibrated in the air before slowly disappearing into the steady drumming of the water. He tilted his head, listening to the decay of the sound, finding a strange comfort in the way it vanished. It reminded him that everything, the city's noise, the stranger's intrusion, the restlessness in his own blood, was temporary. He lifted his hands from beneath the quilt and rubbed his thumbs together one last time. He noticed that the skin felt soft, the calluses from his years of gripping the tea strainer in the city seeming to have softened in the humidity of the house. The tension that usually resided in the crook of his shoulders had dissolved, replaced by a heavy, honey-like lethargy. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the simple physics of the quilt, for the way it forced his body to stop fighting the gravity of the room. He began to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the iron hum of the train, the screeching brakes, and the oppressive heat of the station platforms where time was measured in delays and frustrations. He compared that jagged memory to the velvet silence of the quilt. The transition felt like a chemical change, as if he had been distilled from a volatile liquid into something stable and clear. The city man was a ghost, a flickering image of a person who hurried for the sake of hurrying. The man in the bed was something older, something more authentic. As the minutes passed, the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof shifted in his perception. It was no longer an external sound. It had become a heartbeat, a steady, percussive pulse that synced with his own slowing heart. He breathed in the scent of the room, the faint musk of old paper, the ghost of Nolan Gurr, and the damp stone of the walls. These were the sensory anchors of his childhood, the markers of a place where the world stopped demanding things of him. His awareness began to fray at the edges. The thoughts of the footprint and the clinical scent didn't disappear, but they lost their sharpness, becoming blurred like ink on wet paper. He stopped trying to solve the puzzle of the intruder and instead allowed himself to drift. He felt his consciousness detaching from the logic of the day, sliding away from thought and into pure, unadulterated sensation, the warmth of the cotton, the weight of the wool, the distant rhythm of the storm. He closed his eyes, and the darkness was not empty, but filled with the amber glow of the house's memory. He slid into a deep, dreamless sleep, a descent so complete that the boundary between his body and the bed vanished. Outside, the rain continued to fall in sheets, washing the courtyard, scrubbing the red oxide floors, and erasing the wet footprints from the sill, leaving the house in a state of pristine, silent suspension.